college campuses have become hotbeds of illiberal education. Not liberal education, but illiberal, in the sense that too many college students, it seems, are more interested in hearing echoes of their own voices and of their own thoughts than of having a more intellectually diverse and challenging environment.
Coming up on In Contrast, Bret Stephens, a conservative in the age of Trump. In Contrast is a production of New England Public Radio and Quixote Productions. Bret Stephens is an op-ed columnist for the New York Times. He is the former deputy editorial page editor of the Wall Street Journal and the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post. He is the author of America in Retreat, The New Isolationism and the Coming Global Disorder. In 2013, Stephens won a Pulitzer Prize for his commentaries. Bret Stephens, it's a pleasure to have you in the show. Thank you for coming. I want to start by asking you for an assessment of college campuses today. Where are we and how have we come to the point where we find ourselves?
Reality generally looks different from the inside than the outside. So I'll offer you an outsider's perspective, which is that college campuses have become hotbeds of illiberal education. Not liberal education, but illiberal, in the sense that too many college students, it seems, are more interested in hearing echoes of their own voices and of their own thoughts than of having a more intellectually diverse and challenging environment. Now, I'm sure there are people who hear that and say, well, that's not really true, and Stephens is exaggerating, and maybe I am. I'm outside the academy. But just in the last year, the number of college speakers, visitors who have been harassed, quarantined, chased, assaulted, denounced, almost barred from coming to campus is frightening. And we're not talking about David Duke types here. We're talking about regular conservatives. Ben Shapiro, to take one example. There was a big ruckus about his appearance at Berkeley. He required several $100,000 worth of security. He's a never-Trump conservative. Why would he be such a controversial speaker? Heather McDonald takes a view on debate about police. It's a conservative point of view, but it's not a disreputable point of view. And yet she, too, encountered this extreme resistance. Charles Murray at Middlebury and Professor Allison Stanger, his moderator there, were met with violence. That's a bad sign because now, especially in the era of Trump, we need our universities to model an entirely different kind of discourse and behavior centered around liberalism in the real sense, as in liberalism as in the ability to maintain an open mind and to respond rationally and persuasively to a diverse set of views.
So how did we get here?
That's a large question. I go back to The Closing of the American Mind, the famous, notorious, if you prefer, book by the University of Chicago philosophy professor Alan Bloom, who was warning back then that colleges had substituted politics for education. And there was a kind of a toxic combination, on the one hand, of a certain kind of utilitarian instrumentalism in the approach of many students to college who just saw it as ticket punching on their way to profit-making careers. And on the other hand, political orthodoxies that spent most of their energies denouncing so-called dead white European males on behalf of kind of a relativist orthodoxy, which ought to be a contradiction in terms, but that's in fact what had become. Bloom himself dated that change to the late 60s and the takeover of college campuses by campus radicals. So it's been a long time in coming. And I think now, in a sense, we're witnessing the process of a sort of half century of ugly fruits of this kind of education where college ends up being a much more political place than it ought to be. My college education was a sort of a respite from the rest of the world, an ability to address serious questions and raise serious questions of your own without feeling that you were quite of this world, so to speak. And I think that's a shame. I think our politics are going to suffer from it. Now we're suffering from it from the political right, thanks to the Trump presidency, but we may well also suffer it from the political left, too.
Now, you went to the University of Chicago, and in part, as you say it in a speech that you delivered in Australia not too long ago, was because of that book, The Closing of the American Mind. If this, as Bloom states it, goes back to the 60s, and I'm not posing this as a way of doubting it, but as a way of framing it, we have been at this closing of the mind for 50 years, and yet we have also been training the new generation of politicians, the new generation of scholars, the new generation of op-ed editors and writers and so on. So the outcome is perhaps already evident on the various spheres. I wonder if you have a reaction to that, but I wonder also if I can push you for some nuance or some detail. Are the rebellions...
I'm a conservative. I don't do nuance.
If the rebellions, if outbursts, if the activism of the 1960s connected with the Vietnam War to a large extent is, in your mind, very different from what we are experiencing, or is rebellion? It doesn't...
Look, let me make a few points. Number one, there's a perfectly valid case to be made that the American Academy of the 1950s was a stifling place. Number two, one important difference between the 60s and today is that in the 60s, the students seemed to believe in free speech, not to oppose free speech. Number three, those students had a direct stake in the political life of the times because of the draft, because they feared being drafted into a war that they believed was morally and politically wrong. Those conditions are all different from what we have today. So it's absolutely the case. I mean, it's always easy to draw these sort of fine lines of connection between one era and the next, and I don't want to take that case too far. But there is a kind of prevalence of a certain kind of radicalism on campus, a radicalism in which the objective is to teach the students the right conclusions, politically speaking, rather than the right methods of reaching those conclusions. The right methods ought to be discursive, interrogatory, skeptical, dialectical, and above all, open. And that's what I hope we can preserve. The speech that you mentioned that I gave in Australia was titled The Dying Art of Disagreement. And in order to disagree well, you have to understand well. That means you have to understand the position of your opponents before you can even attempt to knock them down, which is one reason why people who really feel that they want to defeat the conservatives of the world ought to be the ones most intent on listening to them.
I want to pursue that line of thought in a second, but I want to persist on this topic that we had before. And I wonder if there is an asset in having these campuses as places where youth rebellion, dissent that is tolerant, that is open, that is engaged, is a way to expiate, when you're young, these demons of screaming and shouting. Again, no doubt, in full endorsement of your view, that needs to be done in a tolerant, respectful, open, engaging, dialectical way. And that prepares you for the later stage of life where you are, by anatomy and biology, more moderate, that colleges need to foster this type of worldview as long as they do it within the parameters of civil and civic engagement.
Well, that's my fear. Your youth is a time to rebel. It's a time to think thoughts that you may later come to regret. I'm not sure colleges actually create environments in which it's possible to do that. Everyone now wants to be a member of the resistance, but there's a kind of groupthink within the resistance too. No one was, I think, more passionately opposed to Trump's candidacy than I was, coming from the right side of the spectrum, not the left side. Let me give the Trump supporters this. If there is a Trump supporter on the campus of Amherst College, there goes a brave man or a brave woman. That is to say, at least that person, whatever else you might think of his or her politics, can stand aside and against a fairly suffocating political monolith in terms of the prevailing cultural attitude. I'm always going to have time for someone who's prepared to be unfashionable. That's always true up to a point. Like most great truths, you can drive that much too far. I don't have time for someone who wants to be unfashionable by wearing brown clothing and wearing a stormtrooper armbands, because those are emblems of mass murder, historical mass murder. I think every college needs a society of skeptics. Every college needs to be willing to openly debate very painful subjects. The old child expression, sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can never hurt me, needs to be reaffirmed. The idea that language somehow is tantamount to violence, or that the purpose of college is to protect the feelings of students rather than to actually rather aggressively disturb the feelings of students. All that's concerning to me. The prevailing view that somehow students need to be coddled is amazing and dangerous, because what we're trying to do is prepare adults and trying to prepare leaders. As you know, your post-collegiate life doesn't give you the benefit of the kind of permanent infantilization that you get by always having someone walk delicately over your sensibility.
In your speech in Australia, and in a number of different pieces that I have read by you, because you are a champion of open, dialectical, respectful, tolerant views that dissent has an essential function, at what point questioning everything, doubting and dissenting, might actually not advance the principles of open dialogue, but bring it down?
Yeah, I mean, at what point does it become corrosive? You can find examples of various points at which it does. I think that psychologically healthy people have to maintain an inner tension, an inner strain between self-belief and self-doubt. And the two have to operate almost at the same time. You meet someone who has too much self-belief, he's insufferable, he's arrogant. You meet someone who has too much self-doubt, they're practically crippled. They can't get up in the morning because of the fears and questions that reasonable people might have. So intelligent people always have that tension within them. And intelligent colleges, intelligent societies also need to foster a kind of healthy inner balance. You have to maintain some healthy balance between skepticism and conviction. You have to maintain your skepticism, but only up to the point that you don't forgo or abandon some inner hope that at the end of that skepticism, there lies the possibility of an answer to important questions you have about how to lead your life, how to seek justice, how to seek the beautiful, these sorts of permanent questions. One of the things I was grateful in terms of my education at the University of Chicago was that the teachers I had were alert to that. We didn't read the great books to treat them as religious documents. We read the great books to go after them, to ask hard questions about what a Hobbes or a Rousseau or whoever, what they have to say. I think Alan Bloom, was sort of treated as this kind of old fogey champion of the old line of education. Alan Bloom was a gay man, a bon vivant, lover of French and Greek literature. He was not kind of a stodgy, right-wing, antediluvian creature from the 50s. His championship of these books is that they opened minds, and open minds understand that the life of the mind is a life of clashes, questions, and fissures, and disputes. And it's in the having of those things that we become genuinely, and in the broadest sense, liberal human beings. Good people and good citizens alike. And that's what I hope that education is still able to do.
One of the questions in political philosophy, and one of the questions of any thinking person, is who becomes a leader and who becomes a politician and who ends up being the representative of the rest. What happens often is that those that are a byproduct of the type of education that you're just describing that is most successful end up not pursuing the line of career that will ultimately be deciding your life and my life, because there is little space in the public sphere for authentic critical thinking, for authentic engagement with ideas. It is mostly sound bites, and it's mostly following along party lines. And though we feel proud in colleges big and small or universities to be training a young generation that ultimately will be in front of us and lead us, we are also aware that the brightest among us are not necessarily going to be the ones that will be at the helm. And proof of it is the situation in which we find ourselves. Certainly not the most knowledgeable or the wisest or the most sensical. Have we given up on the sphere that leads us, where those that we are training, hoping in the classroom to be open and dialectical and humble, the knowledge that they will not go there?
You've raised a really interesting subject that preys on my mind. One of the tragedies of American politics today is that it has become kind of a contest between the shameless and the stainless. Either the Anthony Weiners of the world go into politics because they're almost incapable of shame, or on the other side, the holier-than-thou, I've never so much as had a cup of coffee, stainless types go in. And there's very little room for people who are thoughtful people but have made mistakes, said things they regret, had one problem or another. Why? Because our approach, and this is true of the media, is to savage them for it. So any normal person who maybe thinks, well, I haven't led quite a perfect life, or there are aspects of my life I don't necessarily want minutely dissected by the press, or if you go into government, by some FBI investigator who's going to track down everyone you might have ticked off in college for an interview about your character and so on. They say to themselves, why do I need this? So I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to go and sign some endless disclosure forms because it's just not worth it if I'm going to be an assistant secretary of this or that. I'm not going to run for Congress because I don't want to put my family through some endless hell of living in a glass box. And that's really problematic. God forbid I should think this thought, but we really need to adopt something like the discretion of the French, or at least the sang-froid of the French when it comes to the personal realities of their politicians. We have a hard time in this country not going to extremes. And maybe it's because you and I have a Latin American background, which has its disadvantages, but also, I think, considerable wisdom. There's also an understanding that you should only draw your conclusions, your points, your arguments 70% of the way, and that there needs to be emollients when it comes to our judgment of people. I mean, take someone like David Petraeus. David Petraeus is one of the most outstanding people who have ever served the United States, and did so with distinction. And of course, he made a personal blunder of the kind that Dwight Eisenhower is said to have made in his day. Thank God Dwight Eisenhower wasn't sacked for that. And so now, he's out of politics. He's working, I'm sure, quite profitably for a major private investment group in New York, and he will have a fine life. But what a shame to run a guy like Dave Petraeus out. And why? Because Petraeus was capable of holding himself to a standard of conduct that, of course, the Anthony Weiners of the world or the Donald Trumps of the world don't do. So we've been left with these very unpalatable choices. I mean, people listening to this podcast will say, well, there are other things like the political gerrymander, which is a real issue, driving politics increasingly to the ideological extremes. The requirements of funding campaigns is brutal and also, I think, harms our politics. So there are many factors, but I think not the least of which is that we, I think, have collectively failed to allow for normal people to participate in government, both as elected and political officials, in a way that any normal ego psyche can sustain.
Maybe, Brett, it goes farther that you're putting it. Let me throw in here the DACA 800,000 kids whose status is hanging and who have been a kind of ping pong ball here, going from one side to another in a merciless, cruel way. What we often praise in the DACA students are the outstanding ones that are going to college, that are receiving full scholarship, that are excelling in this or that activity. These are 800,000 people. There has to be a large middle there that is not going to college and that is not committing the crimes are the bad hombres or bad mujeres that the Donald Trumps are saying. And we seem to often forget that it's in the middle where many of us are, where the mistakes are made, but we might end up sacrificing the path here or the path there. That is so often not perceived in the larger spectrum because that spectrum is unforgiving to those that are not the leaders, the champions, the ultimate bastions of this extraordinary society of ours.
One of the ways in which the United States has succeeded, perhaps the way, is that we have been able to find human potential and maximize human potential among the middle of the bell curve, so to speak. Intellectually, physically, etc., we make the most out of ordinary, average people. The Soviet Union was at least able to find the smartest math students, the smartest physicists, the most talented ballerinas, the most brilliant chess players, So that system like the Soviet Union was perfectly capable of finding that the 99th percentile and making use of their talents. But the Soviet Union collapsed because it couldn't handle everyone below them. I mean, there was the nomenclatura, the communist, the political elites, and then there were the chosen few who were the Sakharovs, and everyone understood he was a physics genius, and you'd put him in charge of the H-bomb project. There he would be. Roman Ruska was a Nebraska senator who said about a Nixon Supreme Court nominee, there ought to be a place for the mediocre man on the Supreme Court. And of course, he was roundly mocked for this statement. We want clearly talented lawyers and jurists on the Supreme Court. But there was something to that comment, which is that societies that are able to make allowances even for mediocrities are probably the ones that are going to thrive, because guess what? Most of us are mediocrities.
Right.
And a society that tries to keep them down or out or belittle their contributions is not one whose prospects are going to be good over time.
I want to bring you to another topic. I'd like you to reflect, to compare, to separate two walls. The wall that has been already built in part and is the promise of Trump. It was the promise during his campaign, and it is still a topic of much heated discussion. And the wall that is in Jerusalem and that divides Palestinians and Israelis. These are, granted, very different realities, very different societies on both ends of the wall. In the end, though, walls are walls and they separate people. So why would one work and the other wouldn't? Or would they both not work? One of them is far more advanced. But there's two particular walls that are so controversial.
It's a little facile, the question. There was a Berlin Wall. It was meant to keep people in that were desperate to flee. It's very different from the set of defensive arrangements along the demilitarized zone that is meant to prevent South Korea from being overrun by a regime as destructive as the regime in Pyongyang is. That's also a kind of wall or defensive barrier, whatever you want to call it. I lived in Israel when the decision to build, it's really mostly a fence. It's a wall only in certain areas.
Right.
It's mostly a fence. And it was made actually by Ariel Sharon with great reluctance, because in that case, the idea implicit in the fence or the wall was separation. And after all, the great idea of Yitzhak Rabin, Shimon Peres, the peacemakers, was separation, two states. So whether you have a wall or a border, it's some kind of this side you and on our side us, right? It's wrong to compare the two. If Mexico were a country that was sending suicide bombers across the Rio Grande, and that every other day in San Diego, in San Antonio, in McAllen, 10 school children were being blown up on a bus because a Mexican had come over and strapped explosives and shrapnel to a vest on his body, then people would say, well, yeah, let's have a wall. And one of the things that I find so dismaying about the Trump supporters is that they view Mexicans as, well, these guys are just terrorists. So I'm sure the terrorists are coming up. You know, there's this kind of right-wing fantasy that all the terrorism is going to come slipping through the Mexican border. Actually, all the terrorists come on visas through American airports. The wife of the San Bernardino bomber, the 9/11 hijackers. There's been one case of a terrorist trying to come through our land border that we know of, and he came through the Canadian border. And this was the Millennium Plot in 2000. By all means, build that wall along the Canadian border. So this wall has a very different intention. This wall is essentially a wall of ethnic separation, trying to keep out Mexicans who overwhelmingly want to come to this country to work, to provide, to contribute, to raise, hopefully, children who become American citizens and who contribute to the well-being of the country. They're coming here because they want to participate in American life, not destroy American life. And I think that's a real distinction, I'm sorry to say, with too many Palestinians today. Those Israelis aren't acting out of malice or caprice. They're acting out of very bitter experience that I witnessed because I lived in Jerusalem during the height of the Second Intifada. There was a bus bombing down the street from my apartment in one direction and in another direction. These were bitter experiences that Israelis went through before they said, okay, let's build a fence. Now, the fence has adverse consequences, and there's no question those adverse consequences fall heavily on Palestinians. But something also has to change among Palestinians who too frequently cheer when some bus full of Israelis gets blown up. That also has to change.
Aside from the terrorist explosions, which are no doubt, and I myself have been a witness of that during my different stays in Israel, the result of all this is that there is an ethnic separation between the two, or a religious one, or maybe it's a mix of both, that it is the terrorists that end up hijacking the entire relationship between the two sides, and the suspicion that falls on those that are Palestinians or those that are Israelis because they are simply Palestinians or they are simply Israelis. They have no larger political intentions, are one that ends up breaking this schism that is at the root of how the Jewish state was created. It is a Jewish state created with a population that was already there. It's a very complicated situation. I'm not advocating for bringing down the wall or reducing the military buildup in order to protect the country that is at the mercy of this anger that comes from the Arab world. Look, but what do you do to bring the two?
I mean, people say, Bret Stephens never criticizes Israel. Okay, a really potent criticism of Israel is not how it treats Palestinians, because every settler and settlement left Gaza in 2005, and Gaza became an entrepot of terrorism. It was taken over by Hamas within 2 years. Hamas has started 3 wars in the space of less than 10 years. The real criticism of Israel is how it treats Israeli Arabs. They are about 1/5 of the country. Mohammed is a popular name in Israel. You go up to Nazareth, you go to Jaffa. Many cities in Israel have large, distinctive Arab populations. And Israel certainly has a lot of work to do to fulfill its founding promise, the promise of its Declaration of Independence, in making those Israeli Arabs truly feel like full members of Israeli.
And how can that be achieved?
Of Israeli society. Investment in communities, educational opportunities, a greater effort to make sure that Jewish students are learning Arabic. It's not just Arab students learning
Arabic is a language that used to be taught in Israeli schools, and less is so as of late.
Exactly so. And so that's work that Israel has to do. And Israel is, by the way, no different from any other Western society that labors under a combination of prejudices, circumstance, all kinds of things that go into making the task of national integration a difficult one. And that's true in France. It's true in the United States, most certainly. It's true in Canada. That's, I think, a very legitimate area where Israel has to do better. But it should be criticized in proportion. It has to be sort of seen as a state that has been in a state of emergency, almost actually from the day it was founded. And it's a nation of human beings who, by the way, who make mistakes.
Absolutely.
And Israeli leaders have not been immune from making those mistakes. Judge them as human beings who err, not as criminals whose every intention is malevolent. One of the things I dislike about the discourse I hear too often about Israel, someone once said, Israel is the only country in the world expected to behave like a Christian nation. Don't treat the Israelis differently, or don't judge the Israelis by a different standard from the standard we judge any other Western democracy faced with similar sorts of circumstances.
Connecting it with what you were reflecting on at the beginning with the University of Chicago and the dissent, there has been an ongoing stifling of different views in the very foundation of the State of Israel has emerged from different corners of the Israeli society as our free speech or our capacity to engage in open dialogue. This is not a regime that has been supporting that.
I don't call Netanyahu a regime. He's an elected leader. There's a lot I don't like about the Netanyahu government, and certainly the right-wing turn of the most recent government, the one that was elected a couple of years ago. Some of the rhetoric about the Arabs in that election, by the way, has been ugly and stupid and shameful. But at the end of the day, Israel is a country that savages itself every day. And if you don't believe me, just click on haaretz.co.il and see an example of what it means for a country that's willing to take a hard look at itself, even to the infuriation of many Israelis, sometimes to my infuriation as well. And I'm waiting for a moment in Palestinian society when there is a Palestinian Haaretz, where there's an Egyptian Haaretz. How much healthier would Syria be today if there had been a Syrian Haaretz? So there's no question that there are illiberal instincts in Israeli politics and Israeli government, which is true in other places. We should object to them. We should fight vigorously against efforts to suppress speech, and I always have, by the way. And we should hold Israelis to account. When that sergeant murdered a Palestinian in cold blood, there's a huge controversy about this. But at the end of the day, the state of Israel put him in jail. The question is not whether a country has criminals in them. The question is what that country does with its criminals.
Right. Last question. I want to go back to the very idea of open, engaging dialectical thought, and would like you to conclude by reflecting on your own maturity in the last 20 years or so, on how your thoughts, your process thinking, your engagement with different topics in the world, not so much what the topics of interest are to you, but how you, in your mid-40s, engage them today that is different from when you were recently a graduate from the University of Chicago, or in your 30s, or maybe even in a kind of futuristic way with engagements that might happen later on. How do you assess where you are, the sharpness of thought, the labyrinths that one sometimes enters as a thinker, and the process of selecting what matters?
That's a large question. Look, age is a humanizing experience. And what I hope that age, a little bit of age, has given me is maybe a greater sense of forgiveness and tolerance towards patience, I hope, and less rigidity in my thinking. The truth is that the world is a mysterious place. People are mysterious. I'm mysterious. I mean, do I really know who I am? Does anybody, when we really start looking into these questions? I hope I'm a more humble person than I was in my 30s and my 20s. Maturity ought to lead to humility, because on the larger questions, you begin to understand your own insignificance a little more clearly, and you also understand the contingency and the imperfectness of your own thoughts. Even the word imperfectness suggests the imperfection of my own thoughts. One thing that has differed, and this is more concretely political, is the rise of Trump and his absolute domination of the Republican Party last year made me take a much harder look at the party to which I had belonged for many, many years. That was a genuinely eye-opening and in many ways a humbling experience because, all of my confident assumptions that he would never get anywhere, of course, proved totally wrong. A lot of my assumptions about the character of some of my fellow conservative pundits proved mistaken as well. People say to me, you're so courageous for having a post-Trump. I don't consider it courage. I consider it screaming common sense, like noticing that it's raining outside. I feel like everything I've said about Trump has just been a statement of the obvious. The only difference is that statements of the obvious appear to have the color of wisdom when everyone else has lost their mind. These last 24 months have been a very teaching experience. Among other things they've taught me is reserve judgment a little more often. And of course, I'm in the business of offering judgment at least twice a week, so professionally, that's a difficult thing to do, but at least in my inner life, try to reserve judgment, try to be mindful that I could very possibly be wrong and that someone else has a better idea and that I'm not too old to change my mind.
Bret Stephens, it has been wonderful to have you on the show. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilan.
If liberalism is the theory of economics that believes that individual choices encourage free competition in a self-regulating market, illiberalism refers to the excesses of the left, particularly of those expounding a worldview that rotates around political correctness. Its principal argument is that just as fascist tyrannies limit liberty, so does affirmative action and other programs designed to help disadvantaged groups. The 2016 presidential election exposed deep divides in our country, and the ascent of Donald Trump and of populism in the world at large have only accentuated those divides. The result is that everyone is more radical these days. The left, particularly among the young, is less patient, more irrational. And the right has embraced essentialist ideas that seek to disrupt the harmonious development of pluralistic societies. Too much of one thing is unhealthy. The best approach to life is through moderation, finding a balance. American politics have been stable because of moderation. That's what the pendulum of power does. It moves from one end to the other, regulating both sides. But moderation is scarce these days, which is worrisome. Lack of stability always comes when an extreme viewpoint eliminates its counterpart. No matter where one stands ideologically, illiberalism is an important system of beliefs in that it forces us to take a hard look at overprotectionism. The American dream is about equal opportunity and about individual self-regulation. Political correctness, when turned into a dogma, is an illness. Next time on In Contrast.
There's a big difference between the American and European press. The European press tends to be affiliated with one party, and there's no firewall between news coverage and opinion pieces, the editorial pages. In the United States, there is that firewall.
Robin Wright, a foreign correspondent in action, next on In Contrast. Let us know what you think about In Contrast. Review us on Apple Podcasts or send us an email to radio@nepr.net. You can also follow us on Facebook. Our interns include Katie Chen, Antonella Dominguez, Delina Hatgu, and William Harvey. Our music is by the Fresh Cut Orchestra. The executive producer of In Contrast is John Vosi. I'm Ilan Stavans. Thank you for listening. In Contrast is a production of New England Public Radio and Quixote Productions.